So to introduce myself, I'm Maggie FitzHerbert. I'm the Senior Responsible Sourcing Manager at Soil Association Certification. My main role is to manage the legality work streams that we run, in particular with the UK timber regulation, EU timber regulation, but I'm also the technical lead for the EU deforestation regulation as well. I've been following the EUDR since its inception 3 or 4 years ago, and those that were doing the same will remember the mounting body of evidence which showed that the existing timber regulations weren't really succeeding in their aim of reducing global deforestation regulations, and may not have had the impact of even reducing the amount of illegal timber in the EU as well. And the EUDR is aiming to address lots of those gaps to cover legal deforestation as well as illegal, and to bring agricultural conversion into scope, as this is known to be the leading driver of deforestation by far. So the EUDR is designed to disrupt business, because business as usual is leading to global forest loss at something like 10 million hectares a year. So to not address those gaps is very much at odds with all of the green objectives of the EU and other areas around the world. So I've got a bit of experience in due diligence from other commodities as well. In a previous role at the International Conservation Organization, ZSL, I headed up advisory work streams for forest risk commodities. And I've seen how the rubber industry and how the palm oil industry is also trying to tackle EUDR. And I would say that they're probably even further behind as well, and starting at this from a really, really basic level. So I think that I'm hoping that the different kind of commodities and industries can take some learnings from one another to try and tackle what is undoubtedly an enormous challenge for everyone. So without further ado, let me try and share my screen. One moment, please. Can you confirm, can you now see the presenter view for that?
Yes, we can, Maggie. All good.
Great. Thank you. So to briefly introduce Soil Association, we're a UK-based certification body, but with global operations. Our certification schemes relate to responsible and sustainable land use, and we are owned by the Soil Association charity, who were formed over 75 years ago with the mission of working for sustainable land use, healthy environment, and healthy people. Our work in timber has been going since 1992 with the founding of the Forestry Department. So we certify FSC and PEFC for forest management and chain of custody in over 60 countries in total, and we do training provision for FSC auditor courses as well. I sit in the climate and landscape team, which looks after the legality and responsible sourcing. So that includes training for EUDR and EUTR, due diligence work for gap analysis, third-party verification, and also our partnerships work, such as our long-term partnership with TDUK to support the verification of their members' compliance with the timber regulations. So I'm going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes or so just looking at some of the broad picture on the scope and the timelines, traceability, and some of the next steps, which hopefully will dovetail nicely with some of the topics that Sylvia has already covered. So to go back to basics, the primary responsibilities, the primary requirements for products is that they're deforestation and degradation free, legally produced in the country of harvest, and covered by a due diligence statement. These need to be demonstrated verifiably that they are free from deforestation, legally produced and covered by a due diligence statement. The reason why the verifiable part is important is because it means that evidence of compliance needs to be presented up front. So this is a very big step up from the timber regulations. It's not innocent until proven guilty. You have to provide credible evidence of being compliant before trading. So this is a significant change. With regards to the product in scope, anyone who already has obligations under the timber regulations will be familiar with the products, but there are a few notable additions, in particular charcoal, seats, So as well as chairs, which we now have seats as well to address that loophole, and printed materials as well. And then just a note on packaging, where it's being bought and sold as packaging. So you're buying a whole stack of boxes or crates, then that is in scope. Where it's being used in its packaging function to support or transport another product, then it is out of scope. Also out of scope is recycled material. So this is products that have completed their life cycle and would otherwise be disposed of as waste. They are excluded from the regulation. Bear in mind that pre-consumer waste and manufacturing byproducts do not meet this definition, and they are not exempt. So if you're not sure on which side of the fence you are on that one, then I'll refer you back to the EC Waste Directive for the full definitions. Where you have products that combine both recycled and non-recycled input, then all of the due diligence requirements for the EUDR will apply to the non-recycled part. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any guidance yet with regards to how you prove and demonstrate which parts are or aren't recycled within a product. Very high level look through the timeline. So the deforestation cutoff date, as I'm sure you're all aware, is December of 2020. So this means that if the land was covered in forest in December 2020, no products can be grown on that land and still be compliant within the EU, assuming that there has been deforestation or degradation under the definitions provided in the legislation. In June last year, the legislation was published with an 18-month implementation period for the majority of companies, and December of this year is when it is due to enter into force. The legislation also stipulates several other things will happen at the same time. So the country risk benchmarking assessment will be published, the information system will be ready to go, so they say, and the EU timber regulation will be repealed. I'm going to come back to that. In June of next year, the entry into force for the remaining companies will come into play. So this is small and micro enterprises. Bear in mind, it's not small and medium enterprises, small and micro, and it only applies to companies who are not previously in scope of the EUDR. And the small and micro companies is who are registered as such in December of 2020. So it will, in the context of the timber industry, it will only apply to companies who have those new products in scope that weren't in scope previously for the timber regulations. In June of next year, there'll also be a review of scope, which will include a review of whether things such as biofuels need to be included. And then finally, in December of 2027, the EUDR will no longer apply to any material. So for the EUDR to EUDR transition, up until December 2020, up until December 2024, the EUDR will apply to timber. And after December 24, the EUDR will apply to new products. But the previous one will apply to some existing products if they meet a certain criteria. The criteria is that the trees were harvested before the EUDR was published last June, and the wood was placed on the market after December of this year. So what this means in practice is that if you have stock of material or products in your supply chain that have been harvested since last June, you won't be able to trade or export them after December this year without being EUDR compliant. And as mentioned in the previous talk, we don't yet have any clarification on how those two systems will operate in parallel. If we have some material on the market which is following the EUDR requirements and some which is following the EUDR requirements, we don't yet know how that's going to be managed, but it's certainly something which is very important and gives me a bit of a headache when I try and think about it. So to move forward for the categories of the different operators, I've spent a fair bit of time trying to get my head around the different types of companies who are categorized with different due diligence obligations in the legislation. And so I'm going to try and distill that down for you now. A couple of quick definitions. Operator is anyone who, in the course of commercial activity, places relevant products on the union market or exports them. So with the exception of the addition of exports, this is a familiar definition. This is what we think of as an operator for the EUDR. However, it has been made more complicated than that, unfortunately. Making available on the market simply means it's the supply of a relevant product for distribution, consumption, or use on the union market. And a trader is pretty much anyone else. So it's any person in the supply chain other than the operator that makes products available on the market. So to try and put into boxes the type of companies who have operator responsibilities, we have the first places on the market, what we think of as the traditional category of operators. So these are companies who are importing the timber into the EU for the first time, or if they're a forest owner or harvester, whoever is placing the timber on the market for the first time from the forest. Standing trees is not a product that's in scope of the EUDR, so it is whoever is placing that first product that's in scope on the market, such as roundwood, sawnwood, etc. Next up, we have what's called the downstream operators. So this is companies in the supply chain who are buying material that's already on the EU market, and they are transforming products from one product to another. I'm going to come back to each of these in a bit more detail as well. Next, we have the companies who are exporting from the EU. They also have operator responsibilities. And then finally, just to really confuse things, non-SME traders have the same obligations as the downstream operators as well. So let's pick these apart a little bit. If you're an operator in any of those categories, an operator or someone with those responsibilities has to exercise due diligence prior to placement on the market or exporting from the EU, not trade non-compliant products, submit due diligence statements and do public reporting. This public reporting piece is another area on which we have very little information on the exact extent of what is expected to be publicly disclosed. And finally, to cooperate with the competent authorities, with the enforcement bodies, and inform them if a product that has been placed on the market is at risk of non-compliance. So this means that there is a legal requirement for disclosure in relation to non-compliance. Look at the downstream operators specifically. So you're in this category if you're transforming a product from one HS code to another. So if you're using some timber to make a product, then even though the timber is the same, the raw material is the same, the timber has one product classification and the product has another. So the product that you're placing on the market is considered to be a new product placed on the market because it falls under a new HS code and that particular thing wasn't for sale previously, despite the fact that the actual raw material it was made from has already been on the market. If you're in that position and you're one of these downstream operators, then your supplier should have a due diligence statement reference number. If you are a non-SME, then your due diligence can include, and apologies for the use of air quotes, ascertaining that due diligence was carried out by suppliers. So in terms of what does it mean, ascertain that due diligence was carried out, at one end of the scale, it could mean that you're repeating the full due diligence to check that it was adequate and meets your own standards. At the other end of the scale, it could simply be that you are checking that they have a reference number and you take that at face value. The result is likely to be somewhere between the two, and it's a question that lots of stakeholders and various trade federations have gone to the EU with, and it's another thing which we are hoping will be covered in the upcoming FAQ documents. So as well as ascertaining that due diligence was carried out, you need to gather the due diligence reference numbers of your suppliers and submit a due diligence statement. If you're an SME, you only have to provide the previous reference numbers. You don't have to do that full due diligence piece. For the sake of clarity, just in terms of what SMEs are, so this comes from the European Commission definitions. So if the company whose staff numbers and economic weight fall below these limits. So for medium, it's up to 250 employees, turnover of up to 50 million euros, and a balance sheet of up to 43 million. So if you're in that category or below, then you're considered an SME. So what are the responsibilities for the exporters? The due diligence statements are required in all cases because the due diligence reference number has to be included on the export documents. So an operator will typically be exporting products that are already covered by the due diligence statement. And if they have simplified requirements, refer you back to Article 4, Paragraph 9. So what they need to do is this ascertaining that due diligence has been done and provide the reference number of those due diligence statements. And finally, the non-SME traders, so traders being companies who are selling the same product that they're buying, essentially. So they have the same obligations as the downstream operators in the majority of cases anyway. So the trader obligations are like the operator obligations unless they're SME traders. So an SME trader obligation is just to collect the supplier company information, the supplier due diligence reference numbers, the information about who's buying the product, and then they also have that same responsibility to inform the competent authority if they become aware of a non-conformance. So that requirement, the legal requirement to disclose non-conformance is maintained for traders as well. And all traders would have to fully cooperate with any enforcement activities. I'll just summarize this in a table. I would be interested in if anyone has a different interpretation on any of this, because it's not laid out clearly anywhere. So this is a result of me going backwards and forwards and cross-referencing the different articles within the legislation and the various FAQs. So as far as my own interpretation goes, this is correct, but it is very much subject to change based on the next round of implementation guidance. So if you are an operator, first placer on the market, then you have responsibilities to do due diligence and to submit due diligence statements as both a non-SME and an SME. If you're a downstream operator and you're non-SME, then yes, you have to do due diligence, but you can ascertain that due diligence was carried out and use some of your suppliers' due diligence as part of your own, and you have to submit due diligence statement. If you're an SME, you don't have to do the full due diligence, but you do need the supplier's due diligence statement, and you do not have to submit statements directly. If you're exporting and you're a non-SME, then you have to do due diligence and you have to ascertain what was carried out by your supplier. And yes, you have to submit statements. If you are an SME, you also have to ascertain that the due diligence was carried out and do your own due diligence and submit statements. So as an exporter, in all cases, there's some due diligence responsibilities and statements have to be provided in all cases. Finally, if you're a trader, if you're a non-SME, then you do have due diligence responsibilities and you can ascertain your supplier's due diligence and you have to submit statements. If you're an SME, you don't have to do due diligence. And as far as I can tell, it's not specified whether or not you have to submit statements as well. So the end of that section, now I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking through some traceability elements as well. Sylvia has covered already in detail what is required on the statements themselves and what's in the information system. So I'll skip those bits and move straight to this slide. So the huge challenge of traceability and trying to link specific products with certain plots of land is enormous. And I'm going to sort of reiterate some of this, even though it has been covered in the previous talk. So when you're trying to work out how do you link a certain product to a certain plot of land, broadly speaking, there's two paths. You can go down the path of material segregation or declaration in excess, or a combination of both. Segregation is operationally very difficult. There's restrictions within the supply chain infrastructure that make this very challenging, but it does mean that the data that goes through the system is accurate and that operators within the supply chain are collecting, passing on data which reflects the true origin of the product and is much more efficient in that sense. The declaration in excess, as I understand it, can be used as an aggregated list of suppliers. So where you don't have that segregation, or it's not possible to have that segregation, then you would say, okay, I don't know specifically which forest it came from, but it came from one of, these 40 forests, because those are all the suppliers into this factory, for example. So this might sound easier because it reduces the need for segregation, but it's very difficult to maintain, and you have increasing confidentiality challenges because you have more and more data. The operator has to take full responsibility for compliance of all of the declared land, and bear in mind that once the data becomes aggregated, it can't be disaggregated again. So as it moves through the supply chain, the volume of data will go up and up and up. More data is more due diligence, more evidence of compliance will be needed upfront for that wider and wider area. And ultimately, it will mean much more risk as you go down the supply chain. So a note on composite and mixed products. All relevant inputs to a manufacturing process have to be from known origin. It can't be mixed at any step of the process with commodities from an unknown origin, because unknown is treated the same as from deforested land. So what this means in practice is that there is currently no provision for a mass balance system. Penalties for non-conformance are very high, as well as confiscation of products and revenue. There's also a fine of up to 4% of the company's EU-wide annual turnover. And there's provision for the fines to be proportional to the environmental damage, as well as the value of the commodities, with fines increasing with repeat infringements. So what this means is that there's an attempt to create strength within legislation, that businesses can't anticipate fines and calculate them in as part of doing business as usual. That it wouldn't be possible to be caught for non-conformance and still have that as being a profitable purchase, a profitable supply chain. So as well as that, there's also provision to be excluded from the market entirely. So what does this mean if you're a business outside of the EU? If you're trading outside of the EU, such as just in Great Britain, then you don't have any direct legal obligations, but you may well have a commercial imperative to act on this. If you're within the EU, then you'll have obligations as either an operator or a trader. If you have products destined for the EU, then you'll receive information requests about things like the geolocation, harvest date, and so on, coming up the supply chain. So as a non-EU company, even though you don't have a legal obligation, you'll need to share the geolocation and harvest dates to allow your EU customers or your customers' customers to comply with EUDR, and failure to do so would result in exclusion from the EU market. And just with regards to Northern Ireland, there is still no official announcement. We heard from Ross at DEFRA at the TDUK Learning Day a couple of weeks ago, and he has confirmed that there is still no official line on whether or not they'll be looking at simultaneous compliance with the EUDR and the UKTR once the EUDR gets repealed. These are just some quick recommendations that the Soil Association has for all companies. So first up is just to understand your overall exposure to this legislation. So whether or not you're directly or indirectly impacted, whether or not you have products in scope, and what your place is in the supply chain, and whether there is a chance that your products might end up in the EU supply chain. If you're in a business-to-business context, there's a good chance that you don't know who the final consumers of your products are. You also want to understand whether there are any origin or supply chain risks with relation to deforestation, degradation free and legally harvested in the country of origin. Once you've done that, we recommend that you start reviewing and revising your procedures, policies and operational activities, because it might be very disruptive to your company. So look at your existing risk assessments, due diligence systems, traceability systems, and see, are they going to fit? Are they going to be able to meet the requirements of this due diligence system for EUDR? In lots of cases, you'll be needing to look at your staff capacity and knowledge and see whether or not it is currently adequate to meet the requirements, and so that you can start trying to map out what resources are going to be needed. And the next step will be to take action, to have an implementation plan, educate and engage your suppliers. Although on that one, actually, I think maybe considering we're now in July, I might put engage and educate your suppliers back to the understand exposure. So I think every company should be doing that now. And to really map your supply chains to understand if you have any blind spots or knowledge gaps in where your materials come from. And so when you start getting those information requests, particularly on geolocation and dates of harvest, you at least have an action plan that you can start communicating to your customers to give them the confidence that you are working on this. So that's it from me. If you want any further support and how Soil Association can help you, please do get in touch. We have training courses, due diligence system auditing, and other services are available. So please do come and talk to me. Otherwise, I hope you found that useful as a very, very quick overview. And I think I managed to maybe make a tiny bit of time back. Yeah, we'll look forward to speaking more in the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you. Rupert, please stay here. And we do have a few more questions left. Allow me to again invite all of our speakers back, and let me share the questions.